Hanna Rodriguez's life has always been full of hardships, which made it unpredictable and sometimes even shocking. Despite the fact that Hanna's family wasn't exactly wealthy, her parents tried to provide their two daughters with everything they needed. Goldie was 3 years older than Hanna, but since they looked very much alike, it was almost impossible to notice the age difference. Since Goldie had always been bolder than her younger sister, she often took the few gifts that their parents managed to give them for herself. In the early years, those were dolls and drawing sets, and in later years, clothes and jewelry. Meanwhile, Hanna patiently endured all of her sister's insults and barely even tried to stand up for herself. Only once, when the father gave his youngest daughter an amber bead necklace, Hanna refused to give such a beautiful thing to Goldie. Of course, the older sister immediately decided to appropriate Hanna's jewelry and even tried to take it by force. "No, these are my beads. Dad gave them to me," Hanna screamed with tears in her eyes. But there was no stopping Goldie. Eventually, her insolence and physical strength helped the girl get what she wanted. However, when Goldie thought that she had finally won and was getting the beautiful piece of jewelry, the bracelet tore and the amber beads fell to the floor. It was only then that the girl realized what an unfortunate mistake she'd made. Hanna spent a long time crawling around the room on her hands and knees, picking up the beads scattered all over the room. Although she managed to collect most of them, a couple had rolled into the gaps between the floor and the baseboard. Since there was no way to make the necklace out of the remaining beads, William Rodriguez made them into small bracelets instead. "It's so pretty, Daddy," Hanna said, having put on her tiny hand. Goldie made several attempts to take the bracelet away from her sister, but it was pretty much impossible to do. Hanna was always on alert and took great care of her most prized possession. Time passed, changing the lives of our heroes. When Hanna was 12, their father died of pneumonia. Until the very last day of his life, he tried to provide his children with everything they needed. Left a widow, Jacqueline Rodriguez didn't show as much concern for her daughter's well-being and chose to prioritize herself over her children. Unfortunately, Goldie looked up to her mother and tried to copy her behavior in everything. Thus, she treated Hanna as if she were a servant and not her younger sister. Hanna had to go through a lot before the teenage girl could get used to the fact that after the death of her father, there was simply no one to protect her. It was at this turning point in her life that she made a new friend who would later become her beloved fiancé. Ethan Adams went to the same school as Hanna, and therefore no one could stop them from making friends. Ethan's parents died in a plane crash, so he was raised by his grandmother from the age of 5. Margaret Adams was a tough woman who wasn't afraid of any hardship that life threw at her. She always found the strength to move on, her head held high. When Ethan and Hanna started dating, the woman immediately realized that they were a match made in heaven. While Jacqueline Rodriguez dreamed of marrying her daughter off into a wealthy family, Mrs. Adams didn't care about money or social status. Wise with life experience, the woman knew to appreciate sincere feelings that came from the heart and had no ulterior motive. At first, Jacqueline was against Hanna's friendship with Ethan, but then she realized the futility of her attempts to stop it from happening and gave up, turning her attention to her eldest daughter. Goldie always thought of herself as the most beautiful woman in the area and had no doubt that she would easily find a rich husband. "While my little sister dates some poor guy who can't give her anything, I won't be wasting my time," Goldie told her mother in an intimate conversation. By the time they graduated from high school, Ethan and Hanna had already made plans to spend the rest of their lives together and were ready to get married. Realizing that there was no one to help them out financially, the young people decided to find jobs in order to save up some money and rent a house together. Until they could make it happen, their infrequent meetings took place at the home of Margaret Adams, who was always very happy to see Hanna. Ethan was the first one to find a job at a construction store warehouse. Of course, working as a loader didn't bring him much money, but it was still better than nothing. It took Hanna a lot more time to find a job she could do. The problem was that most employers didn't want to hire a recent high school graduate with no work experience or specific skills. But even though it took some time, Hanna did eventually get lucky. The owner of the flower shop on the corner of Park Street was kind enough to give her a chance. Now that the young couple had some financial independence, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Jacqueline Rodriguez never really helped her daughter all that much, but after she got a job, she stopped doing it altogether. At that point, she was way more interested in Goldie, who found herself a rich boyfriend whom she intended to marry. Therefore, Hanna was forced to resolve her problems on her own, and she did it masterfully. All this time, the young woman couldn't stop dreaming of her upcoming wedding, which was to take place in a month. Despite the financial difficulties, Ethan used his first salary to buy himself a used motorcycle, so he could get around much easier and wouldn't have to rely so much on public transportation. Since his battered iron horse was very old, the young man spent more time repairing it than actually riding it. Unlike most fast riders, Ethan liked to look for the cause of the breakdown and change old parts for new ones. Within a couple of weeks, the engine of this old motorcycle stopped making funny noises and started working like a clock, to the envy of all passers-by. Back then, Hanna couldn't even suspect how dangerous her fiancé's seemingly innocent hobby actually was. There's a good chance that if Ethan hadn't taken his motorcycle to work that fateful morning, all the tragic events that followed could have been avoided. Unfortunately, the young man didn't get further than a mile away from his grandmother's house when he got into a terrible accident caused by a truck driver who drove into the oncoming lane. The impact of the collision was so strong that only a pile of mangled debris remained from Ethan's motorcycle, and the young man died on the spot. Rescuers and paramedics who arrived at the scene were unable to help him. The news of Ethan's death caught Hanna at the very moment when she was selling flowers to a happy young couple preparing for their wedding. Upon learning of her fiancé's death, the young woman was so shocked that she actually fainted. The frightened store owner immediately picked her up and, fearing for her health, drove her to the hospital in his car. The young woman came to her senses only a day later, and the first thing she said, "Where's Ethan? Why isn't he here with me?" Apparently, the stress she experienced caused temporary amnesia, which must have been her brain's way of trying to protect the young woman from more distress. But no matter how hard the doctors tried to keep Ethan's death a secret, the news still reached Hanna, even at the hospital. Needless to say, Hanna was devastated. Losing one's fiancé a week before their wedding is simply unimaginable. At this time, Margaret Adams was the only person to try to support the young woman, who by the will of evil fate, didn't even get a chance to put on her wedding dress. Jacqueline Rodriguez, on the contrary, took the news very calmly and simply kept repeating that God had his own plan for everyone. In fact, she felt a sense of relief now that Hanna would be able to direct her attention to someone more worthy in the eyes of her mother. Even though the woman didn't know it yet, fate had yet another surprise in store for her, and it came from Hanna's attending physician. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I have some very good news for you. I think that after everything that happened recently, it will certainly give you something to be happy about." The doctor began cautiously. "What's the news, Mr. Matthews?" "My daughter lost her fiancé in an accident and is now in the hospital. What good can come out of that?" Jacqueline challenged him. Alfred Matthews paused for a second and then said, "Your daughter is pregnant, Mrs. Rodriguez, about 6 weeks." "What? How could she be pregnant? Is she supposed to raise her child on her own now? No, this isn't good news. Do whatever you want, but I don't want to hear anything about this pregnancy ever again." Alfred Matthews turned pale and caught himself thinking that he didn't like talking to that toxic woman. Of course, he had no right to terminate the patient's pregnancy without her knowledge, and even if he had, he never would do it. Therefore, the doctor made it clear to Jacqueline Rodriguez that he didn't intend on doing anything that would harm the daughter's health. Jacqueline snorted and left the office, deliberately slamming the door instead of saying goodbye. There was only one thought in her brain at that moment. She needed to get rid of that baby. She didn't want to be a grandmother, nor did she want to take on responsibility of supporting her daughter and grandchild. But when Jacqueline suggested that Hanna should terminate the pregnancy, the young woman was furious. No, I won't do it. This is Ethan's baby, and I will never betray the memory of the person I loved. Hanna exclaimed with tears in her eyes. "You don't know what real life is, you fool. Why take on the responsibility of raising a child at such an early age?" Jacqueline refused to let up. But Hanna stood her ground and openly expressed her disagreement with her mother's opinion. "Well, then you'll have to raise that baby on your own. Don't even think about coming to me for help. You got it?" Jacqueline said before leaving. Bitter tears were flowing down Hanna's cheeks. The poor young woman was feeling desperate. 3 days later, the young woman was discharged from the hospital. The only person who came to pick her up was Margaret Adams, who had already buried her grandson by that time. The old woman knew about Hanna's problems and decided to help her. "Move in with me, dear. I have a big house. There's enough room for everyone. And don't be mad at your mother. She's a good woman. She just doesn't realize what she's doing," Mrs. Adams said, hugging the young woman. At the mention of her mother, tears welled up in Hanna's eyes. Goldie also didn't understand her younger sister's desire to keep the pregnancy and tried to change her mind any way she could. But Hanna was adamant in her decision, and no one in the world could convince her to change it. 7 months flew by, all of them exactly the same. Hanna was getting ready for her due date and was looking forward to the day when she would get to meet her baby. Margaret Adams supported the young woman as best she could and started treating her as her own granddaughter. "I'm so happy that I got to live long enough to meet my great-granddaughter," Mrs. Adams said with undisguised pride. Soon, Hanna Rodriguez was advised to go to the hospital as she was at risk of going into early labor and could thus avoid the dangers associated with it. Hanna's roommate was a woman from a wealthy family, which had surrounded her with all the possible cares and luxury. Norma Murphy, just like Hanna, was expecting a girl, and talking about it helped the expectant mothers to become friends. Norma's husband Tyler came to see his wife almost every day, while the only visitor Hanna got was Mrs. Adams, who could only come in once every 3 to 4 days. Tyler Murphy was the type of man who gained his financial prosperity and position in society through marriage. Terrified of his father-in-law, Tyler did everything possible to ensure that his wife was never in need of anything. "You have a good husband. He's so caring," Hanna said with a smile. "Yes, Tyler loves me. Where's your husband? Why is it that only your grandma comes to visit you?" Norma asked, without realizing how insensitive she was being. Hanna suddenly turned pale and turned to the window without saying a word. Tears welled up in the young woman's eyes at the mere thought that Ethan would never get to see his own daughter. Trying to calm down, Hanna involuntarily touched the amber bracelet that was hanging around her wrist. So many years have passed, but she still cherished her father's gift. About a day before labor, Hanna's mother and older sister suddenly came to the hospital. Looking in surprise at her visitors, the young woman couldn't figure out what they wanted from her. It was highly unlikely that Jacqueline Rodriguez and her eldest daughter wanted to see the newborn baby, who'd be their granddaughter and niece respectively. It just so happened that Norma had already gone into labor, and thus, Hanna had been all alone in the room for several hours already. Seeing the amber bracelet on her sister's hand, Goldie suggested, "Let me have it for a while. You definitely won't need it for the time being, and I'll keep it safe for you." Feeling a sharp pain in the lower abdomen, which in this case signaled the approach of contractions, Hanna didn't see anything wrong with her sister's proposal, and therefore willingly gave her the bracelet. Soon, the nurses came in and took Hanna to the delivery room. Since the woman's physique made it risky to have natural birth, the doctors decided to perform a C-section. Hanna didn't remember what happened next. She plunged into sticky darkness and only thought about the color of the stroller she would get for her daughter. The woman woke up a few hours later and, feeling some dull pain in her lower abdomen, asked the on-call nurse, "Did I have my baby? Is everything okay?" The woman's pale face made Hanna immediately realize that something awful had happened. "Why are you looking at me like that? Where is my daughter?" Hanna exclaimed, starting to cry. "I'm sorry, miss. Please accept my deepest condolences. You have to be strong. Your baby was stillborn." Hanna's mind went dark. Her heart seemed to have broken into a million tiny pieces, causing the woman excruciating pain. Her cry, full of despair and inexpressible longing, was heard throughout the entire hospital. Meanwhile, Norma Murphy was nursing her daughter, who was born a few hours ago. Norma's parents were over the moon. They couldn't be happier and kept thanking their daughter and Tyler, who'd been pale as chalk all day long and was clearly very agitated. It just so happened that Norma and Hanna were discharged from the hospital on the same day. Unfortunately, only one of the women was leaving as a happy new mother, while the other one was losing her mind from grief and fighting the rapidly developing depression with the last of her strength. Having looked at Hanna, Tyler Murphy suddenly put his hand in his pocket and pulled out the amber bracelet that William Rodriguez gave his daughter many years ago. Turning the strange little thing in his hand, Tyler put it back, having decided to postpone dealing with it. It's hard to even imagine what Hanna had to go through in the years since the loss of her daughter. 25 years is a long time, a quarter of a century. Margaret Adams and Jacqueline Rodriguez both died during those years. Even though there was a rather big age difference between them, they passed away in the same year. Hanna's sister Goldie went from one boyfriend to another, developed a drinking problem, and eventually hit rock bottom. Sometimes she came to visit her sister and, being always drunk, kept asking her for forgiveness for something. Hanna, on the other hand, remained true to herself and worked as a cleaning lady in the same flower shop where she first got her job when she was still young and beautiful. As for Hanna's personal life, nothing had changed there. Loneliness and sadness became her main companions in life. One day, as Hanna was on her way home, she witnessed a very strange scene. There was a little girl about 6 years old riding her bike on the road. The child clearly didn't understand what kind of danger she was putting herself in. A gray-haired man in his 50s was running after her, trying to catch up with the mischievous little girl. Realizing that there was no time to waste, Hanna grabbed the handlebars of the little girl's bike and pulled her sharply towards her. At the same time, a squeal of brakes was heard and an off-road vehicle passed by, dousing them with the heat of its engine. Fortunately, Hanna made it on time, and the girl escaped with only a slight fright. When the woman caught her breath, the girl took a small amber bracelet off of her hand and handed it to her savior. "Here, take it. It's my gift to you for saving me," the child whispered. At that moment, the girl's companion finally arrived at the scene of the incident. Apparently, he was the child's grandfather. "Molly, why do you always have to make me worry? I asked you not to go onto the road," the stranger exclaimed, trying to catch his breath. But Hanna couldn't really hear him because all she could focus her attention on at the moment was the girl's bracelet. It just so happened that the young woman had seen it before. Moreover, Hanna had got this very bracelet from her father, and it used to be a necklace first. "Where did you get this bracelet from?" the woman asked in a trembling voice. The man standing in front of her became visibly agitated and took the girl by the hand. At that moment, Hanna recognized him. "Oh my God, this is Tyler Murphy, the lucky man who married the millionaire's daughter. But where did he get this bracelet from?" Hanna remembered very well that the bracelet went missing after she gave it to her older sister before going to the delivery room. And she never got it back, which means... But having been the first one to figure it all out, Tyler didn't let Hanna complete her thought process. Falling to his knees, he started begging the woman for forgiveness for what he did 25 years ago. And here's what happened. The truth was that it was Norma who had a stillborn baby on that fateful day, while Hanna gave birth to a healthy little girl. Tyler understood perfectly well what awaited him if Norma's father found out about the loss of his granddaughter. To save his own skin, he paid huge amounts of money to the midwives and Goldie Rodriguez in order for them to help him commit a horrible crime. Because of their actions, Hanna lost her daughter that day, while Norma, on the contrary, got a healthy child. Having gotten the money from Tyler, Goldie gave him her little sister's bracelet as a keepsake. Being a sentimental man, he carefully kept it for many years. First, he gave it to his daughter, Lois, and then to his granddaughter, Molly. Meanwhile, fate had its own adjustments to Tyler's life. First, Norma's rich parents passed away, and then she did too. Only then did Hanna realize that she didn't only become a mother, but also a grandmother, and all at the same time. Choosing to forgive Tyler for what he did, Hanna lifted him up from the knees and asked him to see her daughter, who had been married for 5 years. There was no point in dwelling on the past, and Tyler actually turned out to be a rather decent father to Hanna's daughter. Holding her granddaughter Molly in her arms, the woman looked at the sky and mentally said hello to Ethan, who had just become a grandfather.